You're listening to Have You Ever Wondered? It is Thursday, June 30th, 2022. I'm Chloe, and the title of today's episode is 40 Acres, No Mule. Well, if you know some things about American history, Black history in particular, then it might make sense to you, that reference, because today we're going to talk about reparations. And way back when they first started talking about reparations for previously enslaved Americans, and didn't follow through then either, one of the proposed plans was to give them 40 acres of land and a mule to help them farm it so that they could forge off into the world and start their own whatever. That's not what ended up happening. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Also, a quick producer's note before we get a little heavier than that. My co-executive producer, affectionately known as Leopard on this broadcast, in a brief impromptu meeting we had yesterday afternoon, is concerned that people are not fully aware that if there is a past episode of this show that you are interested in hearing again, you can go to YouTube to find it under my Where's Chloe Media channel. I was talking with him about the logistics of taking down the episodes, the audio episodes, every 24 hours or so, and he felt some concern about that for the listening audience. So I let him know that I would make it clear that you can still go back and retrieve all past episodes from start to now on YouTube, except there may be one missing. I will try to make sure that by the end of today, everything is there. So that's my producer's note. Okay. Have you ever looked at one of those diagrams that shows you the hold of a slave ship? You must have, right? Take a look if you haven't. And even if you have, you know what? Take a look back. Because as in so many other of the ways that the dehumanization of millions of people has been minimized over time, especially in the way that it is taught, the little tiny figures of people on the diagram as unemotionalistic figures line the oval outline of the ship. But then look closer. Look at how they're lined up. Stacked like so many Amazon boxes on their way to eager consumers, ready to rip them open and use them until they are spent. It's not hard to understand from my perspective that when contemplating slavery throughout my life, putting myself in the place of that first experience of newly enslaved, riding for weeks or months in the hold of a ship, trapped lying down with 18 inches of space above their heads and no way to escape the mass of bodies that surrounded them and the mass of water that surrounded the boat. It's not hard at all to see why that would be disturbing to me. I've mentioned many times that I am claustrophobic, highly. And so when I used to put myself in their place, which you have to do to even begin to understand the devastation that was and is human enslavement, the thought of being trapped on that ship would just send me. Not to mention all of the atrocities that would meet them when they got off. The United States is gearing up for what is one of its biggest holiday weekends of the year, Independence Day. Freedom. Give me liberty or give me death. And I love this holiday. It's one of my favorites. I know some people take umbrage with that, but it's not because of colonialism or white supremacy or American exceptionalism. It's because the events surrounding July 4th, 1776 have contributed to my current freedom, even if that's not the intent of the people who engendered it. But contemplating my current freedom almost always calls to mind the enslavement of my not as far back as you would think ancestors. I can't go into this weekend without acknowledging their sacrifice and their struggle. And neither can you. And neither can this country or any of the countries of the world that have benefited from the pillaging of the African continent. About a month ago, California became the first state out of the 50 United States to set up a task force and put forth a proposition for reparations for the descendants of formerly enslaved people. Now, the multi-chapter plan proposes things such as requiring fair wages to be paid for work done, setting up favorable interest rates for those who are trying to get mortgages, free health care, free tuition to certain universities, and quite notably, assistance in lineage tracking. Now, part of that is because you have to prove that you're you have to prove you're a descendant to take advantage of this plan. But it's also notable because many American Black people have incredible difficulty tracing their lineage back past a couple of generations because of the way records were kept or not kept. A few years ago, I was at a bachelorette party for a friend who was getting married, and somehow the conversation turned to race issues and the economy, and someone made mention of something in regards to racial economic inequality not being as pronounced as people say it is. Now, I know we were at a party, but obviously I couldn't just let that go. So I spoke up and I tried to help this person understand by giving them my own example, which I came up with, I don't know, however long ago, of John's shoe store. And I actually use it frequently. I shouldn't have to, but I use it frequently to help explain to people how the effects of slavery are still radiating throughout the Black community today, especially economically. So, let me give you a brief idea of it. Let's say John moves to the United States in the 1700s. He immigrates over here from somewhere in Europe. He's looking for freedom from the tyranny of oh so many crowns. He likes the idea of a brand new adventure in this little America he's been hearing about. And upon arrival to the East Coast, he finds a town like Plymouth or New York or Philadelphia or somewhere in Virginia like Jamestown, and he sets up a shoe store. And although it's always difficult to start your own business, no matter what century you live in, he does all right at it. Meanwhile, my ancestors are in slavery. They cannot read, they cannot write, they cannot own property, they cannot start a business, they cannot move about the country on their own or make their own personal or financial decisions. John's shoe store turns into the prevailing family business, and with each generation becomes more and more prosperous, taking advantage of the privilege of being a business owned by a white man in a country that caters to white men. In the 1800s, John's shoe store is the most profitable shoe business in town. And my ancestors, having just been released from slavery, are trying to figure out, well, what do we do now? They still cannot read, they still cannot write, they still do not have the opportunity to purchase land because they don't have any money, because they've been working for their entire lives for free. And the only skills they have are related to farming or other, quote, blue-collar tasks. In the 1900s, John's shoe store expands. He puts multiple branches in multiple places and multiplies his profits. My ancestors are fighting for the right to do things like not be lynched for walking to the store or voting. And then in the 2000s, John takes his business global. He puts it online and he uses the family legacy of expertise and information and business contacts to start selling his shoes everywhere. Profits through the roof. And my contemporaries, finally, after all this time, educated, finally able to vote, finally able to work, finally able to sit down in a restaurant where there are white people present, and finally able to attend whatever university they would like. They now, hundreds of years later, have the knowledge and the information and the opportunity and the wherewithal to start their own business. And so they do. But the difficulty that they will have competing with John's shoe store, now a billion-dollar multinational conglomerate, doesn't have anything to do with how he pulled up his bootstraps or put his nose to the grindstone and got to work. John's shoe store had a 300-year head start, both in time and in legislation and in public perception of value. And that is just a tiny fraction of one of the many reasons why reparations are necessary. Because the descendants of enslaved Africans are still paying for what happened to their ancestors by forever being behind the 8 ball. Now, you have access to the internet. You don't need me to rehash 400 years of history for you today. And honestly, it's not my job as a person of color to teach you. But I wanted to come to you today just as a reminder. And so I pulled a clip of a speech from Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who had the opportunity not too long ago to speak about reparations in front of the UN General Assembly. I will put a link to where you can find her entire speech, but she really eloquently summarizes why reparations are essentially a no-brainer.
We, the people of the African diaspora, should not have to find ourselves still resisting. It is long past time for the European colonial powers, for the United States of America, to live up to their own professed ideas, to become the great and moral nations that they believe themselves to be. It is not enough to simply regret what was done in the past. They are obligated to repair it. As I stand before representatives of the countries that once enslaved African peoples and the peoples who were once enslaved, as we collectively remember this day, the way for me to honor those who toiled and died and fought is to say this clearly and without flinching. It is time for the nations that engaged in and profited from the transatlantic slave trade to do what is right and what is just. It is time for them to make reparations to the descendants of chattel slavery in the Americas. This is our global truth, the truth we as human beings understand with stark clarity. There can be no atonement if there is no repair. It is time, it is long past time, for reparations for the transatlantic slave trade and all the devastation that it has wrought and all the devastation that it continues to reap. I thank you very much for your attention as we all remember this crime against humanity together. Thank you.
Today's poem is by E.C. Belly, and it's called Etiquette. Sorrow is more alluring when it is complete. Could you please hand it back with the salt? I wanted to talk about this today because a lot of people are going to start celebrating the holiday tomorrow, honestly. And so I wanted to give us all an extra day to think about it, because it's okay to approach something with the solemnity that it deserves and requires, while also anticipating a celebration. So, thanks so much for traveling back in time with me to help understand part of what is still happening to all of us now. I'll see you tomorrow.